now with the rise of China, that sort of opportunity once again presented itself to Latin American countries.
Okay, go ahead.
Talk to us about BRICS and what this bloc has done for Brazil in terms of opening up more opportunities for your country.
Well, the very concept of BRICS underwent an important metamorphosis over the years. In the beginning of the 2000s, it had a lot to do with the tectonic shifts investment banks and consulting firms were predicting for the global economy. So a bigger and bigger share of GDP would be occupied by countries like China and India and Brazil and Russia. So this change in the global landscape as far as the relative size of what you would once call emerging economies was what I like to say BRICS 1.0. So this was BRICS 1.0. So it's BRICS representing the most dynamic and also in terms of scale the most representative emerging economies of the world. But then after a number of years, the BRICS themselves got together and they also invited a representative from the African continent. And they set up a process of consultations on identifying those interests that could be shared, for example, increasing infrastructural capital available for countries, presenting alternatives for development financing. And then they began a kind of institution building process. When you compare, for example, the BRICS platform with that of the G7 have been meeting for years and years, and they never came up with an institution like, for example, the BRICS have come up with the new development bank. There's something that has to do with institution building and presenting alternatives, like the new development bank is what I call BRICS 2.0. And this has also presented another opportunity for the economies of the grouping, and particularly for Brazil, which is pretty much like this. Back in 2001, when would a Brazilian president meet with a Chinese president? They would meet every 5 years. Now, because of the BRICS platform, they meet 3-4 times a year. They meet during the G20, they meet at the margins of the United Nations General Assembly. They meet when you have the BRICS summit, like the ones here in Brasilia. And that is very important because you have shared opportunities, you have shared visions. You use also this opportunity to seize the potential of the business community. So it's very, very important. Let me just give you an idea. When back in the beginning of the 2000s, you thought of Brazil-China economic relations, bilateral trade was $1 billion a year. Now, in 2019, China-Brazil bilateral trade is $1 billion every cycle of 80 hours. So the bilateral exchange is north of $100 billion, and this is only going to go up. So I think the BRICS concept and the BRICS platform has really played an important role for these opportunities to be available for Brazil.
More than half of all Chinese investments in Latin America have landed in Brazil. And when it comes to trade, in 2018, China bought a whopping $66 billion worth of goods from Brazil. But the story is completely the opposite with Russia, India, and South Africa. They're not even among the top 10 markets for the South American countries. China is Brazil's largest trading partner. You touched on the history of this relationship over the years and its importance, but what do you see on the horizon for these two countries?
Well, it's interesting because sometimes when we are using our smartphones, we get a message in the middle of the evening saying your system is going to be updated from, say, 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. So it is also true that Brazil-China relations have been operating within a certain template. And then this template has to evolve as well. So the template is Brazil essentially buys manufactured goods from China, some of them very high value-added goods. And Brazil has been an exporter of mostly commodities, low value-added manufacturers, to the extent that today 1 ton of Chinese exports to Brazil is worth about $2,500. 1 ton of Brazilian exports to China is worth only about $180. So there's a huge discrepancy when it comes to value addition. And one other thing is that although Chinese investment into Brazil has picked up and is going to continue to grow, there was a sort of imbalance between the big size of trade relations, as we've discussed, now north of $100 billion, and other areas for possible economic cooperation. Investment, including transnational investment. I mean, one of the reasons why countries like Brazil need overseas investment so much is to update its infrastructure. And some of the infrastructure projects are transnational in nature. For example, there's the stock of this very interesting bio-oceanic railroad to make a railroad connection from a Brazilian port in the Atlantic to a Peruvian or Chilean port in the Pacific. And I think liquidity centers in the Middle East, in Japan, and particularly in China are the ones that we should tap into in order to make this project develop. So what we have to do is make our relationship more sophisticated. We want to do more trade, but we have to do more than trade. We have to do more in terms of development financing, in terms of infrastructure investment, in terms of technological partnerships. So it's off to a great start because of the relative weight of trade, and now it has to move on to other areas.
When it comes to foreign investment, how is BRICS helping Brazil's economy?
Well, Brazil has always been a very important destination for foreign direct investment. And perhaps, Elaine, not for the very best reasons. Because one of the ways Brazil found to industrialize in the 50s and the 60s was by practicing very protectionist trade barriers and giving specific opportunities for corporations to establish operations in Brazil in order to cater to the local markets. And because the protectionist barriers were so high, the average prices practiced domestically in Brazil were much higher than the international average. So there was an excuse for companies to come, establish themselves here. They cater to the domestic market. But then when you see other aspects that are very important, like for example productivity gains or our research and development investment, we haven't fared very well. So right now what's happening in Brazil is really a kind of structural change in the very nature of FDI. Because Brazil is opening up more, because Brazil is becoming more integrated, let us not forget, Elaine, that in June this year, Brazil, through Mercosur, concluded the biggest trade deal in economic history, either by number of players. I mean, think of all 28 member countries of the European Union and the 4 members of Mercosur, but also in terms of geographical scope. So now, for example, if a Japanese firm or a Chinese firm or a company from the Middle East is considering making an investment in Brazil, not only it will be able to tap into the 3% of global GDP, which is the relative size of Mercosur's economy compared to the global economy, but they will also have access to that which in its entirety is the biggest GDP in the world, that of the European Union. So the kind of investment that will flow in Brazil, of course, will focus on infrastructure opportunities, but there's also this change in trade and industrial policy that will make investment become more productive and better connected to a characteristic that can be found in the very successful examples of countries that have fared well in the past 20 years, which is the so-called GVCs, the global value chains. And of course, if you think of the BRICS as a whole, there is an increased investment in Brazil, especially from China, and the potential is there for other economies too. But right now, the one relationship at the bilateral level, if you judge all of the BRICS members, where you see investment really picking up, is this inflow from China to Brazil.
Global issues like the trade war have benefited the South American nation. As the U.S. reduced exports to China, China began to go to Brazil for more soybeans and cotton. And now Brazil is on its way to become the largest exporter of soybeans in the world.
the U.S.-China trade war has been pretty good for Brazil.
There are punctual benefits that you can have here and there. For example, some people see Brazil as like an immediate, almost automatic substitute for some of what the U.S. exports to China. But these are punctual. I mean, for us, a better and more stable economic scenario is more important than these punctual benefits here and there. And we are also mindful of the many complementarities between the American and the Chinese economies, right? I mean, the U.S. is the top trading partner of China. China is the top trading partner of the U.S. China is the top destination for American FDI. The United States is the most important destination for Chinese FDI. So there's a degree of interdependence there that I think will always keep things at having the doors open for understanding. So once again, what's most important for Brazil, what's most central for Brazil is global stability. And of course, the domestic reforms it enacts on its own.
So there are fears of a global recession. The R word, recession, has been mentioned so many times in recent weeks and months. What is your outlook for 2020?
Well, it is true that there's a lot of policy uncertainty out there, and that this trade standoffs between some of the most important players in the global arena are delaying investment and building on sentiment. But it is also true that perhaps it's the difficult circumstances that allow for other things to happen. For example, Brazil has been able to manage structural reform initiatives that were in the making for many, many years. We finally put them to fruition. The Mercosur-European Union agreement, was 20 years delayed, and in the past 6 months, in the words of an European negotiator, we made more progress than in the previous 2 decades. So it creates opportunities as well. For a country that has to undergo macroeconomic reforms such as Brazil, it's better when you have, say, a beautiful sunny day out there. So we want the dark clouds to be blown away. But it is also true that because Brazil is doing the right thing, when that happens in an international scenario where people are looking for opportunities or opportunities are more scarce, your good example stands out. So I think this is going to be is going to end up being very positive for Brazil. And if we can make it through, hopefully there won't be a recession. There will be a slowdown, and if there's agreement involving the most important economic players in the world, sentiment will become positive again. But if we can make this transition, I think the end of the tunnel will be very important for countries that need to make up for so much lost time as it is Brazil's case.
Deputy Minister Troyjo, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity.